So, like, wow. What a day. We've heard just a compelling set of truly ambitious plans to put AI to work for the American public. Enthusiasm for AI has, of course, already led for the adoption of machine learning techniques across a wide range of sectors of our economy, from law to health. But to hear those detailed visions for how we can achieve national, ambitious, full-scale capabilities to tackle the problems and the challenges we're facing as a nation is, as Panch said, like truly inspiring. And so I just want to thank our colleagues from across the agencies for the aspirations that they set out. Of course, as in prior times of swift and broad technical change, the move to embed AI, whether it's in commercial applications or in these national level capabilities, it's going to expose risks, often to the most marginalized and vulnerable communities. And of course, it's raising doubts and questions about AI's impact on our ethical and our political commitments to human rights, to equity, to meaningful work, and more broadly, democratic values and institutions. So concerns about our future with AI has been generating deep and widespread interest in baking our values into the design, development, and use of technical systems. This interest is in part fueled by the kind of drumbeat of disaster scenarios or small glitches that impact real people's lives. But I think at this point in time, it is also truly fueled by the important and growing recognition that our choices about how we design and use technology are a key and often incredibly durable way that we express, secure, and even export democratic values. The Biden-Harris administration acted really quickly and boldly to affirm the values that should drive our work on AI, from issuing the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, the landmark executive order that tasked agencies all across the government to address risks within their ambit, and really quickly providing guidance to all federal agencies about how to address risks to rights and safety as the government uses AI that touches so many people's lives. The President's EO on AI set in motion a wide range of actions across federal agencies to manage risks and to use technology to build the future we want for ourselves and those who follow. But the administration cannot do this work alone. And the work of this panel is designed to build on that effort and to expand our thinking about our role in that ecosystem. The diverse experts on this panel, like our champions, have truly ambitious plans for building the national level capability necessary to build AI right, as Arthi framed it, by building our rights and values in from the start, not just managing the risks to them. Rights and public values can truly inform our technical choices if we build out the human expertise, the technical infrastructure, and the guidance frameworks necessary to point us in the right direction. So, while our panelists hail from many different disciplines, they each have, throughout their work, contributed to the knowledge base necessary to build this national capability to get AI right from the start. Their work ranges from developing rigorous methods to interrogate the implications of AI and other technologies, to forging new institutions and legal frameworks to shape the design and use of technologies. We truly couldn't have a better group to help us sketch out the path forward towards a technological future that reflects our values and allows us to ensure achieving our aspirations improves the lives of every member of society. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming KJ Bagchi, who's the Vice President of the Center for Civil Rights and Technology at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. Arvind Narayanan, Professor of Computer Science at Princeton University, and Alex Givens, President of the Center for Democracy and Technology. So, So we're going to dig in and really run this as a kind of conversation rather than having lots of opening remarks. And I warned my panelists that we would try to be lively and perhaps even a little controversial. So I wanted to start by asking this question. So we often talk about the important role tech plays in advancing democratic values, but it can sometimes be perceived as a very like generic feel-good statement, like, well, of course, right? Just kind of a throwaway. And I think our champions did a really lovely job of identifying the hurdles, some of which were about rights and risks, but also very clearly the societal risks that were implicated by each of the ambitious plans that they were setting out to take. And I'd like to start by just making this concrete for our audiences and asking if each of you, as an expert in thinking about rights and risks, could dig in on one of the champions' aspirations and talk a little bit about the design choices, the organizational choices, the methods that you would recommend to help them make good choices from the start. And I think we'll kick it off with Alex at the end.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. It's really nice to be here. I'll jump in by talking about the aspiration of how AI can help improve government service delivery. My organization, the Center for Democracy and Technology, has a program that focuses on civic tech and how we ensure equity is protected within it. And this is an area where there are so many opportunities, as were well shared in the presentation, for real improvements that could make a huge difference in the lives of the American people. But the hurdles are real, and I think it's worth naming and focusing on that for why. And one element that I will hit on is the trust piece of it. Why I think it matters in this conversation is that sometimes it's easy to be a little dismissive of this concern, to say, oh, people don't really trust the tech, and it makes you think that all you need to do is explain it a little better, and you'll bring them along on the journey. But when you look at the history, oftentimes the lack of trust is there for a reason. And in the question of government service deliveries, we think about the huge potential for reaching services to people at a particular point in time, which involves better data sharing between agencies, better communication about a person's needs. There are real reasons why customers and users in America today worry about that amount of information sharing, particularly when we think about vulnerable communities, who may have very legitimate reasons why they're worried about government agencies sharing information about their personal needs, about members of their family, about their employment status, about their address. And so that's why these questions about what does privacy-forward service delivery look like? What are the creative approaches to government data sharing that still respect user choice, that really do have effective limitations on how that data is going to be used, so it just is how it matches the person's expectations and doesn't go beyond it, are so fundamental to bake in from the beginning. Another example, trust. One of the real opportunities here about reaching people, we talked in one of the breakout sessions about, text messages or better ways of reaching out to people to say, hey, did you know that these programs are available to you? At the same time, we're seeing ourselves flooded with spam text messages and more fake communications than ever before. And I know every single person in this audience goes through it, and we're going to see, an uptick in that. So one of the real hurdles that we have to think about is how do people know when a communication from a government agency is trusted? What are those indicators? And how can agencies lean into this moment to do the right scaffolding to really let people know this is a communication that you can trust and you can have faith in? And then the third hurdle that I think is an important one just to characterize and again ground in the question of values and what we stand for are questions about access. And I know this was covered a little bit over the course of the day today. But when we think about technology making it easier for people to access services, it is so important that we interrogate the assumptions about what technology people actually have access to, and that the design choices as a result are premised on that. So we don't have assumptions that every single person has an advanced smartphone, that every person has access to high-speed internet. So again, interrogating those choices, making sure that we're really thinking through what those hurdles look like, is just an essential component to this program delivery to really make sure we can harness the opportunities in an inclusive way that lift up all boats.
Great. KJ. Yeah.
I can just jump right in. So again, thank you for including the Leadership Conference in this conversation. I'm going to take the cue for being a little controversial and maybe flip the question a little bit on its head and maybe even challenge some of the framing from through the conversations that were held today. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, we were founded in the 1950s. And so when we think about the role that technology has played in terms of like helping advance the civil rights movement, but also at times being an impediment when we think about surveillance and other tools. This idea about hurdles or barriers to success, like, and we've talked a lot about it, within the center. We have Frank Torres here, our privacy and AI fellow, who's used the example quite a bit about in tech policy, the idea that regulations or the idea of like what are the implications or the impact on certain communities going to be are somehow hurdles is a framing that we're trying to sort of to change. When we develop vehicles at this time, when we think about safety belts or airbags, it's not seen as at this point, right, as a hurdle to developing a vehicle, right? It is part of the development process. And so for that, that's sort of the first kind of foundational argument I would make. The two other quick points would be, again, tech is not a solution to everything, right? I think from our perspective, when we think through some of these programs that have been created in a very aspirational, great motivations, trying to go to a school that is is underserved and underrepresented, and giving each child a laptop. But then like after a year, those laptops start to break. Folks don't have access to the internet at home, right? And so you think through the idea of technology somehow being a solution to all of our societal problems, and therein lies, again, the unstated assumption that is flat out wrong. The final point I would make, again, just all sort of making it foundational, is that, again, thinking about the history of the organization that I work for, technology has not always been accessible, right? And I want to pick up on Alex's point that you can have this exciting sort of development of some kind of tool, but again, is that actually going to be accessible to the communities that it's meant to impact? And so for us, when we think about in this environment, the ecosystem where there is no AI governance outside of the executive order focusing on agencies and vendors and so on that work with the government, for us, when we think about what are the aspirational uses of AI, it is those that have close to zero to no impact on marginalized communities and a disproportionate, like, high net benefit. So when you think about examples such as flood forecasting in regions that may have lower income housing and get hit by floods constantly, to be able to give those communities something to actually access. We think about building tools to help immigrants understand the complicated immigration system. How do they gain access to a visa? And the final example we talked through is, again, like helping students in real time with their writing before they turn in an assignment, right? So again, like there's studies that talk about linguistics and where you're from and your background, your cultural background, and how that can impact the grade you get. Because again, like the way we think about education is still a sort of consistent basis that may not take into account the diverse folks. So in those cases, we do think that AI has the ability these tools have the ability to create benefit. But again, we try to come from the framing of like those foundational arguments that I talked about.
Thank you. Arvind.
Hi, folks. So the aspiration that I want to pick up on is AI for healthcare, drug development, and scientific discovery more broadly. And the value that I want to highlight is openness. It's one that I don't think we've heard much about today. And what I mean by openness is you have all this data, you spend all this money training this model that can really advance science, and then what do you do with it? Do you keep it proprietary, or do you make it available to the public for anyone to download and use and modify for their own purposes and use as they see fit? This issue has been fiercely controversial in the tech industry over the past year or two. And there's lots of ways of getting at this controversy, but I think perhaps one core reason why people have such different opinions on this is, are you thinking of AI as a product or as a repository of scientific knowledge and a tool for advancing science? It can be either of these things. So AI models are obviously, they can be products. And when we think about products like iPhones, we're fine with those being proprietary. On the other hand, AI models are also, in a way, just like the internet is, a way to access knowledge. And when we think about it that way, in the scientific community, there's been this extremely strong norm of openness. And that's actually what has enabled AI to advance so far by people building on each other. And that's changing now. A lot of companies are keeping their models proprietary in the industry. And that's fine if they want to keep their models proprietary. But some have gone beyond that and have said that open models are so dangerous that they should not be released at all. And they are advocating for policies that will make it hard or even impossible to release models openly for entrants in this market to compete and will advantage incumbents. So that is the value I wanted to highlight a little bit. And I wanted to put under the microscope that question of, are open models actually dangerous to release? A year ago at Princeton University, we didn't know the answer to this question. We put together a coalition of 25 researchers from 16 different universities and civil society organizations and the industry as well. And we did a big evidence review. And the conclusion that we came to is basically that the risks have been quite severely overstated. Let me give you one example. There was a paper that raised alarm bells because it claimed that chatbots can help bioterrorists figure out how to create bioweapons. Well, it turned out that the information that the chatbots were serving up was stuff that was on Wikipedia anyway. Right? That's what they're trained on. That's where they're getting that information from. What are we going to do next? We're not going to ban Wikipedia. So we go through a bunch of examples of this sort in the paper. This might change in the future, but as things stand now, based on our evidence review, we just don't see the justification for changing this norm of openness and for seeing these models as so dangerous. There are many other arguments, such as national competitiveness. Are we allowing other countries to build on our research but not give their research back in turn? These are arguments we've debated for decades. We've debated them during the Cold War, and we came down strongly on the side of openness. Nothing about that has really changed today, and I think we should keep revisiting this question. If the facts change, of course, we should change our minds. But as things stand today, I think we should default strongly to continuing this norm of openness, especially when we consider public sector uses of AI. It's good for science, it's good for innovation, it democratizes access to AI, it makes the market more competitive. Yes, there are a few risks, but we think those risks are minimal, and there are many other ways to manage those risks as opposed to putting AI back in the bottle.
So Alex and KJ, I think you both in different ways talked about the importance of learning from history and taking the lived experiences of the public that the government is seeking to serve, whose lives they're trying to improve, involving them in the process. And I'm wondering, the AI executive order, the OMB memo in particular, talks about agencies engaging the public in their use of algorithms, in their use of AI systems. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what does that look like, right? We know what notice and comment rulemaking looks like. We know what it means to do an RFI and solicit public feedback. But when we think about participation in the design of technical systems, how do you think agencies do that in a meaningful way? What are the processes?
Thanks, Alex. I think so. I think the best way to draw out the answer to this is to really give two quick examples of sort of the idea of engaging community and then building a structure and design at a very hyper-local level. Prior to working on the Hill and sort of federal trajectory, my first job out of law school was working for the DC City Council. And if you go up in Columbia Heights on 14th and Park, or Kenyon, depending which direction you're headed, you'll see this pretty large intersection. And part of working for the council member of that region was to go to the community and to get feedback on issues that they're having. And so there'd be different neighborhood associations and so on. And so the neighbors, the residents in that area would constantly complain that the street signal was not, it wasn't long enough for them to be able to cross the street. So you have folks who are elderly, you have folks who have other sort of issues on accessibility, and they're saying 30 seconds is not enough for us to get from one end to the other end. They tried to directly complain to DDOT, but the response was essentially, well, look, we need to study, we got to study traffic patterns, and again, those of us who live in DC know that 14th Street is already a mess, and especially that area in Columbia Heights. So the agency was like, we're not going to do much action here, right, when they heard directly from the residents. When we were able to come in and talk to them and then try to understand and actually go with them to that actual intersection and take a little video of seeing how it is difficult for an able-bodied person to be able to actually jump across in that short amount of time. We were able to then use that as an example to get DDOT to do it. That's a very high.
I'm going to jump in
here.
Sure. So we heard a great aspiration earlier today by Ben Levine, who was talking about basically the infrastructure observatory and being very specific about the kinds of data that would be necessary to do this right. So you, I think, are setting out a range of kind of participatory data collection activities that would need to be supplementing the data that can be sensed or that we have because of the road topographies, where the lights are, et cetera. Is that at least one?
I think, yeah, that is, and I think so. I'll give you like a stronger example that
Yeah.
actually goes to exactly what you're talking about. So researchers at Carnegie Mellon were working, heard from residents in Pittsburgh that there were a lot of complaints about air pollution that a factory was emitting, and they would complain, and they would just, residents were not able to get the attention of local or national figures, right? And so the researchers at Carnegie Mellon essentially started listening to the residents and started to then create a sort of heterogeneous approach towards collecting data. They crowdsourced smells, like what are people smelling? They had video footage of the smokestacks. They started collecting other sort of in real-time air and wind quality data. Then collecting that information, they were able to then go back to the EPA and to say, look, these are the concerns here. And then, I mean, this story has a happy ending, not all of them do, but in this situation, the factory did end up shutting down. But again, this was all in a process of actually working with the impacted community on collecting that data to make sure that the impact was providing a benefit to the folks that were actually impacted.
And terrific. And this is a mixture of, if we think about some of the participatory sensing activities, for example, that NSF has funded. I'm most familiar because I'm a Berkeley professor normally with the one at UCLA. That Deborah Estrin used to run, where members of the public had sensors on their phones, and what they were doing was actually examining air quality, not at a local level, but literally me as a child walking to school. What was the exposure that I had to different kinds of chemicals through my path, through my daily lives, right? So we got like that detailed. But then I think KJ is also pointing out the importance of not just what the sensor could pick up, but actually doing some sort of experience sampling of individuals. What am I smelling, right? Because you were talking about the human sense of smell, not just what the sensor that we might have built into our device, and how that sort of community participation could be used to make sure we're bringing the community in to the data infrastructure of that infrastructure observatory. So I love that. Alex.
Sure. So a couple different thoughts here. I mean, the first is that the federal government is not the only place that is trying to think about this. There's a really fascinating movement right now that's happening in the labor movement around how you center worker voice in the development of AI tools that are being used in the workplace. And they're doing a lot of creative advocacy and case studies showing if you were trying to automate processes, for example, on how the hotels in Las Vegas get cleaned and what is the algorithm for sending people to the right room at the right time, you know who's really good at making sure that that algorithm isn't sending people up and down and wasting their time? The people who have spent their lives actually navigating the halls of that hotel well. And so when you have the people that are actually going to be directly impacted by the system or have the right subject matter expertise at the table, you get better decisions early, and there are ways to do that in a manner that can really empower them. So number one is just look to other spaces. Government agencies aren't the only ones trying to think about this. Two, you actually have some really good resources coming out already. I mean, OMB and OIRA's leadership on this has actually been very admirable in terms of what effective consultation looks like. A couple points that I'll frame on this. One, there's a lot to be said for how you frame the question, because you're trying to get people to see themselves in the problem that you are solving and feel like they have something to add to the conversation that you are trying to lead them down. We find that often when you frame this as input on an AI system or input on a tool, people don't feel like they have a right to be in that conversation. They don't see themselves in it. When you actually say, we're trying to figure out the right way to service these hotel rooms, we're trying to figure out the right way to solve this problem in which you are a subject matter expert or in which you have direct lived experience, it's much better of an invitation in for them to help shape and give that feedback. The other thing to think about is that you don't, there are groups that exist in this world to try and give this type of information and feedback to you. And I'll give two examples. So these are both self-serving because they involve my own organization. That is not by design. I just happen to know what we're doing best. So our organization right now has a partnership with NIST as well as with the Beck Center at Georgetown University on identification systems in the use of in benefits programs, and what the risks are for marginalized communities, how you build user trust, how we deal with some of both the trust and the equity and the privacy considerations and different ID verification mechanisms. And that's a way for NIST to not have to go out and reach a whole, thousands of individual users, but treating civil society groups as a proxy. It is then on us to go help build those relationships, make sure that we're giving credible advice, but we can be a shortcut as a partner. Another relationship that we have is with the Access Board, which is the U.S. agency that thinks about accessibility and disability concerns. And both CDT and the American Association of People with Disabilities have a memorandum of understanding right now for the Access Board's work under the AI executive order. And our job is to help other disability rights groups understand the work that the Access Board is trying to do, the questions they are trying to grapple with, and bring them into that conversation to serve as a bridge. So you don't have to feel like you're alone thinking, how am I going to understand the needs of all of these people around me? There are organizations like ours and many others in the layer of civil society, as well as academic centers, that can play that bridging role for you as well.
Great. So Arvind, you've already talked about some of the ways that the research community is trying to participate in articulating values, right? Openness is clearly a very core value of the sciences broadly. And I wanted to ask you if you could reflect a little bit. So there are a range of efforts throughout the research enterprise that we use to help researchers reflect on the values embedded in their work, right? So certainly human subjects processes, right, that are run by IRBs, but also, NSF and other research agencies asking the question, what are the broader impacts, right? How is your work actually going to change the nation? But we've also seen, particularly in the areas of AI and ML, and I think we could look at NeurIPS, we could look at ICML, we could look at some of the other core conferences, and I'm pointing at you, Arvind, because these are places where you live, where they are requiring researchers in their publications to have a more detailed explanation of societal risks and benefits. And I'm wondering if there are other ways, right? So in our AI aspirations, we asked each champion to identify hurdles and to talk about societal risks. Very simple prompt, but I think it produced really, really kind of rigorous engagement with those issues at the start of their process when we're thinking about the development of the capabilities and what their research agenda is to achieve them. And I'm wondering, Arvind, if you have ideas about other ways to help kind of communities, risks, rights, public values get centered throughout that research process, which it often has to happen really early on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you brought up the National Science Foundation. I think there's a huge role for funding agencies in shaping how research gets done, how values get incorporated into that process. Let me try this. I remember Senator Warner said this is a very nerdy audience. You all seem to agree. I'm going to push my luck and talk about epistemology for just 1 second. So there's a
ways of knowing. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a famous paper in machine learning where, again, in AI for healthcare, they built a machine learning model for helping with hospital triage, what to do when a patient comes in, and the model crunched the data, and one of the correlations it spit out was that patients who had asthma were less likely to develop pneumonia in the hospital. Obviously doesn't make sense. The researchers thought something was fishy. They went and looked in the data. It turned out this was a true pattern in the data. And then they looked at why that is. It turned out that what the hospital was doing was that if a patient comes in and they know that they're asthmatic, they get sent to the ICU right away. They get better care, and that actually decreases the probability of their developing complications from pneumonia, given that they're coming in for pneumonia. So, what the model learned was correct according to the data. And yet, if this model had been put in place for triage replacing the existing system, it would have been a disaster. So this is a kind of risk that I want to highlight that has persisted throughout the application of AI for science. And I think the root cause here is scientists often having a tendency to treat the AI model itself as the store of knowledge, as opposed to a tool for scientific discovery for human understanding. And there's really a big tension between these two ways of thinking about AI and science. And because of scientific pressures of publishing, et cetera, things are often in the realm of treating AI as an oracle. That problem has gotten worse in the last decade. We have a paper called Leakage and the Reproducibility Crisis in Machine Learning-Based Science. It's a mouthful, but the point is that we think this is going on a massive, massive scale. Literally, the majority of machine learning-based science studies, in my opinion, are hard to trust because of delegating too much of the understanding to the model, and therefore lots of mistakes creeping into the analysis. So bringing this back to the National Science Foundation, I think it would be crucial. I think an intervention that is sorely needed is whenever funding is going towards AI-based science, that some portion of that funding, I don't know what number, 10%, 20%, go towards reproducibility studies and other quality control studies so that we can look at what is happening in the scientific literature, identify these prevalent patterns by which mistakes get made, and in addition to ethical values, which, as you pointed out, we have been good at doing in the last decade, at bringing that into the scientific process, bring these epistemic reforms into the scientific process.
Good. So I want to, you're suggesting reproducibility and replicability as key elements of making sure we are not just kind of finding what we want, right? And I would want to suggest that another important component of that is actually having interdisciplinary teams. And this is, if you are a sociologist and you are thinking about data in the healthcare context, you're immediately thinking about what are the incentives of the people who are collecting the data, right? You think about what are the things that are invisible in the data. Anytime anybody says, for example, oh, there was a huge spike in X disease, and I'm like, or maybe there was a medical code that changed, right? Because it could be one or the other. And if you have interdisciplinary teams, and in particular, if you have interdisciplinary teams that represent a particular kind of domain expertise, so for example, people who are experts on, for example, the triage nurses who make the decisions about how to route people who are coming in with pneumonia, you would have seen that right away. Now, I like to call it Rich Karuna, whose paper Arvind was talking about, researcher at Microsoft. The reason he could identify that was in part because they had used really interpretable models, because he was very concerned that using AI would actually occlude his ability to actually understand and debug these sorts of unexpected findings, right? Like nobody thought, oh yeah, asthmatics fare really well with pneumonia, right? They knew there was another story at foot there, but in order to do the debugging, Rich and his team actually had to have this really interpretable model and be able to talk to people at the healthcare institution from where that data had originated. And so I just want to kind of point to that interdisciplinary and domain expertise, as well as the lived humans and the communities. I see Alex waving her mic.
Waving.
Please.
Well, the other point I would add in is just even knowing to ask the questions. So I just want to emphasize what you called out and how you were setting up the templates for the AI aspirations talk today, which is you instructed from the very beginning, please think about the hurdles and think about the risks.
Instructed.
Right. Which is a really important signal to send from the start. And so thinking now, again, let's getting specific, thinking about use cases, thinking about agencies that are doing this work. How do we drive that inquiry of making sure that you are thinking about potential hurdles, thinking about the risks as early in the process as possible? There's some good tools to do that. So OMB has this memo binding guidance on federal agencies regarding their use of AI. It has in there that agencies have to think about the rights and safety impacts of a system. They have to think about minimum requirements to mitigate those risks. How do we push that back early in the stack? So early in the development phase, in the research phase, you're thinking about, oh, those are the types of considerations I might have to have. So one mechanism is just thinking through, okay, triaging, knowing ultimately we're going to have to answer these questions before this product goes live. Let's get that really far back early in the process too. That's a socialization effort. It's the role, chief AI officers, it's other governance structures within the agency communicating that back so that everybody knows that this is part of a decision-making system and it goes back early. I think the other piece of it is how to make that type of guidance, which had to be written at a relatively high level because it had to be relevant to a wide range of agencies. how to start making sure it's interpreted in a way that is relevant for your agencies and the equities that you are navigating. And I think there's a lot of really good work to be done now that there's that original document to work from on what are the additional supplemental documents that can be relevant to different subject matter domains, what's the the process through which the agency or clusters of agencies develop that. That's a really good moment to be getting stakeholders involved. The executive order triggers some of this. So I think there are concrete things now that agencies can be doing to kind of push that earlier in the stack, give guidance to people across the agency to do this work, and just surface awareness about the need to do this type of risk mitigation strategizing from very early on that is important for your mission, it's important for protecting the American people, and it also is just more efficient because you're thinking about those considerations early rather than being compliance issues to think about later in the process.
Okay, so I want to take a little stock. Participation, affected communities, thinking about them not just as folks who come in and look at your stuff, but who actually might generate data and inputs to influence the way in which you're constructing a problem. Question your own epistemology. What are your assumptions about where knowledge lies and how you're actually going to find it? Methodologies for pulling this through the process. I think it's important to think about what the OMB guidance does, which is it doesn't just say, here's a set of goals. It also sets out who's accountable. It sets out tools and methodologies. It sets out transparency structures, right? It does a bunch of things that we know are forcing functions, right? You manage what you measure. We all know this. And so as we're thinking about these different structures in relationship to agencies' use of AI, if we're thinking about big public sector, private sector, as Arthi said, this is an all of us moment, and we want to make sure that the values and the public are infusing the research process, the development process, not just the use. What do we think are like accountability structures, reflexive practice structures, transparency structures that might help through the research enterprise?
I mean, I cannot speak to the research enterprise as deeply because the work we do is focused more on, again, the companies that are actually creating these tools and systems and the governance that's trying to create guardrails to it. So I will just quickly add, and before I kick it over to my colleagues here to dig into the research aspect of this, is that, you know, I do want to go back a tiny bit. Like, we're talking about talking to communities, you know, examining your own bias when looking at data and all. The cheat code to all of this is having the people on your teams that are developing this that come from those communities. And so part of the work that we do in working with these companies and also the newer sort of like emergent AI companies is to talk through the importance of having diversity on their teams and where they're recruiting for, understanding that aspect as well. And beyond that, I do think, again, like that the implications there are much broader. But yeah, I'll kick it over to you to break the research.
No, and that's key, KJ. And I think many of the things that are useful on the product side are useful in the research side. Arvind.
So I'll make one point about this, which is that I think it's important in every particular application, every research project, when you're talking about accountability and ethical issues, to find the line between the issues that can be modeled and tackled as technical problems with technical solutions and ones that are really more governance problems that need, you know, oversight and procedural protections, that sort of thing. So let me give you two examples. So going back to the example of AI for healthcare, one of the concerns that people have, perhaps the foremost concern, is obviously the privacy of the data. But now this can mean two things. One, it can mean I want to make sure my data cannot be re-identified, and when I'm giving my data for research, I want to make sure that I'm not going to face adverse consequences because of the confidentiality of my data not being maintained. There are, to a large degree, I think, technical solutions to that problem. But when people say privacy, very often they mean something deeper. What they mean is something like, you know, you never asked me, you took my data and you're using it for this purpose that I'm not comfortable with, right? And so that's not really a problem with a technical solution because it's not about confidentiality. Even if the confidentiality of their data had never been violated, they're going to feel that way. It's a matter of dignity, respect, participation, stakeholders, all of that stuff, right? So that's a governance thing. Let me give one more example if we have time. So this is in the realm of chatbots. So funny thing about ChatGPT is that well before ChatGPT was released, OpenAI released its predecessor, GPT-3, which was in many ways equivalent in capabilities. It was only a small step in capabilities to ChatGPT. The reason why its predecessors never went viral was that they weren't capable of having chat conversations without doing wildly inappropriate things. Right, just going into a racist diatribe or something like that. So the innovation needed to put those guardrails around chatbots was, in my view and the view of others, some others, the main step between the predecessor of ChatGPT and the actual released version that went viral. And Seth Lazar is one person who's prominently made this point. So this is an example where, to some extent, it was possible to find a technical solution to the problem, but not all the way. One of the major issues that remains is in the process of training chatbots to do this, are they censoring certain viewpoints? Is there a political bias that's been introduced? Those controversies continue to happen, and that's not going to have a technical solution. That's a matter of oversight, governance, participation.
Great. I think that is the perfect place to land. This is not, right, getting values baked into AI from the start is not a technical project. It is a technical, social, and governance project. And it's really great to be thinking about this as we set off to build out and meet our grand aspirations. So if you could join me in thanking our panelists.